Welcome to Energize Community Impact with Dean Eaton and J.R. Woodward. We are here to continue a conversation that we've already started with all of you out there about how churches flourish and become energized for community impact. I'm your host, Dean Eaton, Director of Community Impact for Chorus Connect Australia. And in this series, my conversation partner is you and our special guest, J.R. Woodward. Now, J.R. has been passionately planting churches on the east and west coast of the US. And some of the distinctives about those church plants are the value of tight-knit community, life-forming discipleship, locally rooted presence, and boundary-crossing mission. And he's been developing this for over 25 years. He's the author of what I consider to be a couple of classics, really, in the whole area of missional communities and church planter training. He's the author of Creating a Missional Culture on InterVarsity Press and co-author with Dan White Jr. Of The Church as Movement, also on IVP, and both very available. He co-founded the Missio Alliance and currently serves as the National Director for V3 Church Planting Movement. He is the co-founder of Praxis Gathering, writes for numerous websites and journals, holds a Master of Arts in Global Leadership from Fuller Theological Seminary, and more recently a PhD from the University of Manchester in the UK. Welcome, JR, to this episode.
Hey, good to be with you again, Dean.
Thank you. We're really looking forward to this time with you today. But before we go any further and pursue what we're looking at today, we'd really like to hear a bit more about the V3 church planting movement and how, the Aussie church can hook into what it is you have to offer.
Yeah. Thanks for asking about that. Yeah. So at V3, there's a few different offerings we have. So first of all, we usually do a monthly webinar that's totally free. And so we'll kind of promote that through our various social media. The other thing is a nice introduction is we do these 4 to 6 week immersions, and they have a little bit of a cost to them, but they're a lot more in depth in a particular area. So even today, when we talk about structuring for movement, we'll hit a lot in a little bit of time, but we take like 6 weeks to go through that in an immersion. And they're on a lot of different areas, like developing a discipleship pathway, where we go into even 4 weeks on communities on mission, like we'll talk a little bit about today as it relates to the 4 spaces. So it's diving into one of the spaces more. And then probably our primary thing, these are to kind of give a little taste, but the primary thing is we have this movement pilgrimage. So whether you're planting a church, whether you're starting a business or remissioning your church, we have 3 different tracks of these 8-month cohorts. That's a week to week. Usually the first year planters have 2 coaches, and it's a much more in-depth approach to either planting, we call marketplace planting, or third, the remissioning. So that's kind of some of the big things that we're doing. And then, we're kind of moving into where we're creating a decentralized ecosystem of various ministries and so forth that strengthen kind of this grounded missional movement mindset.
Wonderful. I was talking to Alan Hirsch just yesterday here in Australia, here in Melbourne, and he was very encouraging about the V3 movement and you, and just his admiration for the fact that you guys have done it, and there's some wisdom that you've distilled over the years that you can share and bring to the Aussie church. And so we are so excited as Chorus Connect to be giving platform for all that you're doing, both in your publications, but also with V3. It's just such a wonderful resource. And for many of us, we're really into not reinventing the wheel down here in Australia, so we're keen to learn. So we bless you for that, and we pray for that movement to continue. And one of the things that I heard an Army general recently say was, you don't win wars just by strategy. You also need logistics, right? So you need structure to things, to movements.
Yeah.
And today I'd really like for you to unpack for us the whole matter of being structured for movement, because this is sometimes where I've noticed church planters come unstuck, right? They might
Yeah.
have all the aspirations in the world, but they start to, uh, they can't really get a framework in their
Mm.
minds of being structured for movement. So I guess my first question for you is in the church as movement, starting and sustaining missional incarnational communities, that wonderful book you've written, it says this on movement occurs when the making of mission-shaped disciples who live in the world for the sake of the world in the way of Christ goes viral. I love that. Movement is about developing structures and systems that catapult people into mission, where reproducing discipleship groups, missional communities, churches, and networks of churches is a natural part of its DNA. Wow. I mean, how do you do that? How do the four spaces of belonging, as you've described them, create a structure for such missional movement? Can you unpack a little of this for us? And we do have some visuals to show too as you speak.
Yeah. That'd be great if you want to show the visuals. I think like in understanding structure, these four spaces of belonging are super helpful and important to understand. And I think maybe the next slide is a little picture of the four spaces. I'll let you start the slideshow.
Okay. You got that.
And there you go. And so Edward Hall, he's a sociologist. In the 1960s, he wrote about these kind of four spaces of belonging. And this was popularized by Joseph Myers in his book, The Search to Belong. And so he talks about intimate space being that 3 to 4 people, obviously, that we're most intimate with. Personal space, that's more like 5 to 12 people, right? And social space is a little bit bigger. It can go from 20 to 50, even up to 70 is possible. And then public space, which is 70 more in public. Now, what Edward Hall discovered in the 60s, we actually see Jesus lived into in his time, right? He confided with the 3, James, Peter, and John. He trained the 12. He mobilized the 70, and he spoke riddles or parables, if you will, to the crowds. And so I think that each of these spaces kind of offers some unique things that the other spaces don't offer in the same way, right? So for example, you're not going to probably get your intimate needs met in a public space. It wasn't really designed for that. It's meant to be in more of that intimate space. And you're probably mission, if it's going to be incarnational, and if it's going to kind of be going out part of mission, that's probably not going to happen in your public space either. Discipleship, best takes place in that personal space. That's where Jesus did it, right? That's his 12 disciples who he trained. That doesn't mean he didn't teach and help others, but the parables that he shared with the crowds, he explained to his disciples in that personal space. And so that's kind of the beauty of understanding these spaces. So I would ask you from your sense of things, I know what it's like in North America, and you probably do too, but like, which of these spaces would you say most churches in Australia would give their time, energy, and resources toward? Like if you had to pick out of these 4, and maybe even base their sense of success on.
Yeah, I would say it would be the public space, definitely the Sunday event.
Yeah, exactly. And that's not uncommon. That's the most common way that we look at it here in the US too. And each of these spaces are important, right? Jesus lived into all of them. And so what I think about is intimate space is kind of really designed to help us and everybody in the congregation move from being unknown to known. That's where we really get to take off our mask and be with a few people that we have deep trust and growing trust with. Personal space, what I'm going to suggest is if it's going to be movemental, we have to move from like this small group to equipping disciples. And there's a big difference between those two things. Small groups, in the way that at least they're here in the US, and you can tell me if this is how it's there, but like they tend to be open, right? So new people can come in, which is great. But the problem with that, with keeping them open, is that if you're hospitable, you're always catering to the new person, and you can't really grow in depth with the group. If you're not hospitable, you're probably not going to be growing, and most people aren't going to be coming into that space. What is interesting how Jesus used that space, it was a closed invite only space for him. And that's so he could see real discipleship happen. He could go deeper. Now, it wasn't an isolated group, because that social space is what he mobilized for mission. And so when you have a space dedicated for mission and a space dedicated for discipleship, and you kind of put those together, that's kind of where the power of movement comes in. But I don't know if I have the next slide, if it kind of speaks to that.
Yep. I'll just get it up for you.
No problem. You could probably just, yeah, we can probably keep the slides in if you want. So that third slide, and I wouldn't mind just kind of leaving that up for a little bit.
Yep.
And, you know, I think every church, whatever your structure is, like every church has to ask, what are we multiplying? If you're going to be movemental, you got to be multiplying something, right? Are we multiplying the public space? I mean, we're obviously ultimately multiplying all of them, but you know, when you're thinking about what's the key spaces to multiply, at V3 we kind of suggest it's these, it's personal and within the social space. And so the personal space is where discipleship happens. It's a closed or bounded set, if you're familiar with the bounded and centered set ideas. And the missional community or the social space is really dedicated for mission. And some of the best practitioners would have at least 50% non-Christians that are in that space. We could talk about what that might look like, but this ultimately is something that anybody can reproduce. And as you know, if it's going to be movemental, it has to be easily reproduced. So, and then you can say that if you're committed to that discipleship space, then you also want to kind of start an intimate space with 2 or 3 others. So that's kind of a little bit about it. Personal space, moving from small groups to equipping disciples. Social space, I would suggest moving from community to communities on mission. And then when it comes to public space, I think we either have people who idolize it and make it everything, or demonize it and say it's horrible. You know, that's usually a reaction to the current space with a lot of young people. I think we need to reimagine it. And I think maybe the first part of reimagining it is considering how Jesus used that space. While we tend to be infatuated with the crowds, Jesus understood he had a public message that needed to be addressed publicly, but he wasn't infatuated with the crowds. He was infatuated with people, but the crowds himself, he considered somewhat dangerous. And so, you know, sometimes they want to make him king. He had to run away. Sometimes he tried to get away. They followed him, but he was so attractive in what he had to share that it wasn't hard to get a crowd, but he didn't entrust himself to the crowds. He gave himself over to the disciples, and he banked his mission on what he was doing in that personal space. And ultimately, they were building that social space as they sent them out, you know, like the 70 or 72. So that's kind of, I don't know if you got any questions or thoughts or want to dialogue about that, but I would say this, like the beauty of this is if you're multiplying personal within social space, like that diagram, it's a concrete way to move discipleship from the peripheral of what we do to the very center of what we do. And so what we encourage is like actually to build like an 8 or 9 month discipleship pathway, different competencies that you think every disciple of Jesus needs to learn. How do we, in other words, develop the character and competencies of Christ? And I think that happens in a very dedicated, closed space where you can grow together. It's not, you know, it might have one-on-one aspects to it, but there is a power in it happening in this personal space as Jesus did it. Imagine if you and I were there at the Great Commission, and you know, we were told, go therefore and make disciples of all nations. By the way, that was the commission, not go and start new services, go and make disciples. That's ultimately whether we're going to be successful or not just make disciples in our city, but nationwide. So it has to have a movemental intelligence if we're going to be faithful to that commission that each of us have been given, and what we've been given collectively. And so I think like this is a concrete way to move discipleship to the center. One time Dallas Willard was asked, why don't we have movement in the West? And this was one of my friends, we were at a table with Willard before he passed, asked that question. And what Dallas said in response was, well, because essentially we're not being and making disciples. And so that was the key reason he felt. And then he basically said, every church has to ask two questions. Number one, what is our plan for discipleship? Number two, is our plan working? And what I want to suggest is that when I even say discipleship, we all have an idea what that might be. But if it's not directly connected to mission, it's not really being full-on disciples. And this is why when you have personal space, basically interlinked and inseparable from social space, which is dedicated for mission, part of what you're trying to do is help them build that space, social space, and multiply it. And if you've done that, then you've obviously helped them learn certain competencies that we'll probably go through in further sessions deeper on what some incarnational practices are. But obviously it's more than that, but it's certainly that. And I think depending on your fivefold, you might emphasize just teaching and learning the Bible. Well, you got to learn to be on mission too. And so I think this kind of personal within social space is a great way. And I'll just say one more thing and then anything you have to say. But let me just ask you, like, who do you think's better known, John Wesley or George Whitefield?
Definitely John Wesley. Yeah.
Yeah. And you know why I believe that might be the case? Now, like, and maybe you can tell me why, but they both were contemporaries of each other. Those who study those lives, because when I was doing my PhD at in England, there was different people studying these different lives. Most everybody would agree that George Whitefield was a better preacher, that he had even bigger crowds. And so why do we remember John Wesley? Well, at one point in his ministry, he said, I'm not going to come and do a big crowd thing unless you start bands, which was basically intimate space of 3 to 4 people, classes, which were that 12, where we're talking about that personal space, and societies, which is more like that social space of 50 to 70. And I suggest that because he understood these 4 spaces and understood that the public space is designed to help the other spaces growing, but for him, the conversion and discipleship happened in those other 3 spaces. Mm-hmm. He only did this space in order to see these other 3 spaces replicated. Today, I think the tail wags the dog. We think that everything exists for the public space. I want to suggest that the way Jesus did it, the way Wesley did it, he understood the meaning and the power behind public space, but that was solely to get people into bands, classes, and societies.
So that really flips our thinking from thinking about church planting as sort of spreading a franchise of an institution to literally ground level relationships of disciples making disciples. That's what I hear you saying, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
It is interesting, isn't it, that in the US, the Methodists in the US, Wesley's bands, as they went across the land, I think something like in 1850, I think something like 37% of the population were in his church, right?
Yeah, it's crazy. And I mean, it shows you the power of when you're multiplying and when you're focusing, making discipleship your center as opposed to the crowds. And like, he could grow the crowd. And if he wanted to, it wasn't about his ego and about how much people came to the crowd. For him, it was about really making disciples and seeing movement happen.
Amazing. I mean, the Civil War in the US interrupted the flow of that growth. And when everybody reconvened, they kind of turned the smaller personal space groups for accountability and discipleship, turned them into Sunday school classes, I believe, and it kind of all became all went awry from there because they missed the point, and they sort of started to deteriorate from there. But look, that's amazing history, JR. We're going to have a little word from our sponsor, and we're going to come back soon and talk about some real life examples of how this has been applied.
Hi, I'm Dawn Penny, CEO of Chorus Connect. Our current school students are growing up with little or no knowledge of the Bible and its stories, or the relevance of the beliefs and values of the Christian faith. They're unable to draw on the wisdom that can be found by learning about and from the Christian faith as they navigate life with its challenges and opportunities. As Christian communities, we are able to support our local school students in this way. Through Chorus Connect, volunteers can be trained and accredited to provide this instruction once approved by the Minister for Education for this purpose. Find out more about becoming a special religious instruction volunteer in a school near you. Email us today at impact@chorusconnect.org.au or call us on 03 9811 0999.
We're back with J.R. Woodward from the V3 church planting movement in the US, and we're talking about structuring for movement. And J.R., it's been wonderful so far to hear about how to structure for movement, but I wonder if you could share with us a little more about examples of how this is played out in the field and how it's worked for you in the field. And I believe we've got some more slides we can put up about that.
Yeah, sure. It's a obviously like an important question because while not driven by pragmatics, like I think when you define if it works, meaning like if it's, based on these kind of new ideas of what fruitfulness is, making disciples, seeing new Christians and so forth, seeing the kingdom become a greater reality. We've before I kind of give you some examples, I think the things I've learned, we've been training planters, entrepreneurs, and pastors over the last 9 months 9 years in V3. So we've probably trained, we've had at least about 600 people go through our 8-month training. And what I've understood, as I've kind of worked with different planters, not that like we have a bunch of coaches, but I do get to usually coach a group. And what I've understood is like the degree that people understand the content and develop convictions around it is really the degree that they see fruitfulness. So kind of when I thought about that, like I thought about the importance of, for example, we just talked about the structure for movement, and this is really key to movemental understanding. And yet it's so kind of contrary to how we often practice. And so it takes, the first thing is like just grabbing the content, right? Now, some people might be adversarial toward the content. That's fine. If that's so, maybe they should not do it. But like they have to, then there gets people where they could articulate, they could kind of repeat or say the same things that we've been talking about here. That's kind of one level of understanding the content, but maybe the high level is you start to be advocating for it because you actually probably are practicing it and seeing it work. So content is kind of the theoretical knowledge, and that's one piece that's important, but not the only piece. The second piece is the next slide. And this is probably what's more important is before that, the next one, go back one, is developing conviction. We're here now talking about practical knowledge, right? So we have to move from theoretical to practical. And for some people, like this sounds like babble, or like someone speaking in tongues. It doesn't make any sense. Like, what do you mean kind of emphasize personal? Because when I'm talking about like those who understand that the amount of energy and time that gets moved from public space to personal space and social space is dramatic. And I'll talk about that when I get to the examples. But for some people, this sounds like babble. Others start to believe it. And belief kind of has, we'll double tap on that in a second. But then like when conviction is really when our behavior starts to change, right? And so we start to actually restructure how we do church. Now we work with a lot of people starting things, so it's easier for them to start, but even they come with kind of preconceptions, and they each kind of come maybe at a different stage of their own development. So go to the next slide. I want to double tap on belief and then double tap on behavior. But as you know, like it's pretty common today where people are in the mode of deconstructing. And I don't think deconstruction is bad unless that's where you stay. But I think we're always deconstructing and reconstructing things. But when I'm talking about deconstruction in this particular case, I'm kind of talking about people in their journey of understanding what does it mean to be the church and the life of the church. And so a lot of people in our context are really deconstructing the whole emphasizing everything's about Sunday. And so they know what they don't want to be. And so they've kind of deconstructed, but they haven't reconstructed something. And so when someone is starting to deconstruct, I think it's a form of belief that they're developing, but that belief becomes stronger when they kind of reconstruct it. And that's what we help them do through these 4 spaces and understanding them a little bit differently. Now, the next slide, we double tap on behavior. And this is kind of where I know if someone's convicted and they understand these 4 spaces at a high level of conviction, if they move from just experimenting with these ideas to living them out to the point where now they can equip others, because that's what they've been doing in there, and they've seen it happen well. So with that in mind, I just wanted to kind of share that, because I just want to say that, like, it's one thing to understand things, another thing to have a conviction, and how deep that conviction is really matters on how fruitful people are with the idea. Does that make sense? And so moving to the last slide there, I'll just give you 3 examples. One of our, probably in our early days, Grace Capital City had some of their leaders that did our training. And the interesting thing about them, they already had a very strong view of social space and using that for mission. And so even when they plant, that was from their mother church, that was already a strong concept for them. And so it was easy for us to train. What they didn't have is that personal space within the social space. That was not a strength. And so they entered our training, and it wasn't that difficult for them to start these discipleship cores that became the hot center of that social space. But really within the first couple of years, they had 10 of these spaces going. They were just a church plant. And why did they have that? Well, number one, they had a good team to start with. Number two, they really had the knowledge of the importance of the social space. And so getting a personal space within that wasn't so difficult. And I think that's why they were able to flourish. Now, let me give you a second example. This is a church plant that I personally have been helping to coach, Core Church. It's primarily Korean, but not exclusively. And they started out in public space. The difficulty is that they didn't have many people to start off with, so it was like 15 people that kind of got swallowed up in this public space. That's all they understood church to be. They were just mimicking the church that they came from. When they started the training, they started to develop and understand the importance of a personal space and social space. But as you can imagine, both culturally and other things, it took them time. This was all happening during COVID, so eventually public space got disappeared anyway. So it allowed them to really focus on developing that discipleship core, and then and then just recently the social space. So what I'm kind of saying, it's taking longer for them to develop both the content and the conviction of this new content that's very new to them, but they're doing that. It's happening slower, but they have a really strong discipleship core, and they've just recently started a couple of social spaces, and they have just been so excited. One of the things that they kind of mentioned is, like, they've never really shared their faith with other people. They've never really had relationships with non-Christians. And as they came into this training, now they're meeting their neighbors, they're meeting their people at work, they're regularly praying for non-Christian friends, they're venturing out. And I don't know that they could ever go back to what it was, because it's like they feel like they've become a Christian for the first time. And then the third example here is a church in Hawaii, who Un Strausser, she's a Korean woman who leads the congregation. And what you see there in that picture is their first discipleship core. Okay, when she's, by the way, she's a physician part-time. She is a mother of 3 and a wife of 1. And she's very active in her community. And yet she plants a church, and she didn't start a public space. 90% of her first year was dedicated to these people that you see on the screen, these 12 people, and them building a social space together. So she started with a strong conviction. about the four spaces of belonging, a deep understanding and a strong conviction that she passed on to the people she was working with. She had to deconstruct kind of their kind of maybe love for public space and create a new love for personal and social space. And she did that. So the second year, they had 3 discipleship cores and 3 social spaces. The third year, they're up to 9. Most of the people that you see in the picture are now helping to lead their own discipleship core and build their own social spaces in the spaces that they're at. So all I'm saying is, like, everybody starts at a different place. Everybody has a different geographical area. There's so many different things that might create a slowness or speed as it relates to the fruitfulness. Sometimes the fivefold that we'll talk about here soon, all of those things can kind of dramatically change how fruitful something is. But these are kind of 3 examples just to think about as it relates to the 4 spaces and how it's actually working out.
That's really helpful. Those examples are so clear for us. And I'm really grateful for all that you've been sharing with us about structuring for movement in this episode. And I'm excited that naturally leads on to then talking about leadership, the fivefold intelligence again, because how a church gets shaped up is by the different perspectives of the fivefold intelligence. And so in our next episode, I'm excited to pick that conversation up with you. And we've got a little word from our sponsor before we sign off today. So here's a little word from our sponsor, Chorus Connect.
Hi, I'm Dawn Penny, CEO of Chorus Connect. A recent Mission Australia survey found that more than 40% of school students are extremely or very concerned about mental health. This is why Chorus Connect trains, supports, and offers job placement for school chaplains, as they provide pastoral care, nurture well-being, and advice of a spiritual nature when sought. Our chaplains are a vital part of a school's well-being team, and right now we have vacancies in Victorian schools. So consider joining our team of chaplains at Chorus Connect and find out how by contacting us today, either by email at impact@chorusconnect.org.au or call us on 03 9811 0999. We'd love to hear from you.
JR, thank you for being with us today. We look forward to our next time with you to talk about the fivefold intelligence. But on behalf of all us down under, we thank you again for sharing so much great content-rich material with us today. And thank you for all that you're doing in this space. See you later.
Yep. Take care.